is NDTV. And you're watching NDTV Prime.
India is a young country, hungry for the best opportunities in all spheres, of course, including education. But what more can we do? We keep talking about making education a game changer and how this is what we need to ensure that a demographic dividend doesn't become a demographic disaster. But are we doing enough? What can we do to create more world-class institutions in the country? Joining me today, a very special panel. These are people, of course, who know their stuff, who are invested in education, to tell us just where we are going wrong, what we are doing right also very significantly, and as we always want to know, is the glass half full or not? Well, let me introduce my panel to you right away. I'm joined by Sanjeev Bikhchandani. He's a co-founder of Naukri.com, also a co-founder of Ashoka University. Thanks for being with us. Kerry Parker, CFO of Deakin University, Australia, with us is Dr. Rajkumar, Vice-Chancellor, OP Jindal Global University, and also joining us, Ravneet Pava, Global Executive Director with Deakin University, Australia. Thanks all so much for taking our time to be with us today. Sanjeev Bikhchandani, let me start by asking you. First, if you wear your Naukri hat in response to this question, there is much hand-wringing and chest beating around the fact that in India, the aim of education has increasingly become just employment. Do you think that that's fair, a fair statement to make, and is that a problem?
The aim of some education is employment, but I think every student's aspiration, or most students' aspiration, is employment, which may or may not have anything to do with education. The truth is that most of us in India today are doing jobs that have very little to do with what we studied in school or college. Okay, and that's a reality. But I think, having said that and accepted that, really it's about equipping students for life, and that's a slightly broader aim. And some of it is employment, some of it is other stuff.
Kerry, would you agree? Is that something that works for the world as well? Because the point that Sanjeev is making is something that we've been talking about a lot. That how many of us are actually using our skills, or what ought to have been our skills, and where we ought to have been trained, to what we are doing today. Many of us sort of just land into it by accident. Increasingly, we see courses or institutions that become quite front burner, and they're much talked about, and so they become aspirational, whether or not the students are fit or not. Is that, you think, of something we ought to be concerned about, or not really?
Someone once told me that a person can expect to change careers about 8 or 9 times in their life. So to do a degree and then think that you're going to be doing that for life is probably is an incorrect sort of assumption to make. I think what we need to do is prepare students for life, and part of doing that is to ensure they have an education that will support them to do that. I think students gain a lot of other skills apart from just being educated whilst they're at university. Certainly at Deakin, we have a large graduate employment program where we try to train people or give them ideas about how to start looking for work, how to prepare themselves, how to form their CVs. But we always start with a question about what about them and where they want to go as well.
Dr. Rajkumar, when we talk about world-class institutions, when we talk about, because these are the kind of institutions that will equip students with so much more than just that degree which will get them a job. What does it really mean? What is a world-class institution? Who's going to define one? Because if you pick up if you look at the ads, everyone's now claiming to be a world-class institution. Everyone's throwing some ranking your way. So it's really mind-boggling in a sense, isn't it?
I agree with you, and I think increasingly there is a global consensus in relation to what constitutes a world-class institution. And if you remember, even a decade ago, Indian institutions used to be very skeptical about the idea of international rankings, benchmarking of institutions. But I think the last 5-6 years has had a tectonic shift in both in the mindset and the approach towards world-class universities. We in India started the National Institutional Rankings Framework, in some ways ranking Indian institutions.
Which then again became debated and sort of that opens another...
But a beginning, you're saying? Well, most importantly, as we speak, a new set of regulations have been introduced. This was introduced by Mr. Jaitley 2 years ago in the budget. The idea of 10+10 public and private institutions, which were initially, of course, called world-class universities, and then they defined it as institutions of eminence. But the philosophy and approach to that is pretty much defined. And very interestingly, in those regulations, it has been defined that those institutions, the idea is to be seen in the rankings, and they have actually said the Times Higher Education, the QS, and the Shanghai Jiatong rankings is the criteria for determining whether these are world-class universities. So for the first time in the contemporary evolution of Indian higher education, there is a recognition that we need to benchmark ourselves internationally.
Sanjeev Bikanjani, come in at that point, because again, each time that happens, you know, then we love comparing ourselves to China, and we're just shown up poorly time and time again. We know that we have the IITs, we have the IIMs, we have several institutions which are definitely world-class. Why don't we make the cut?
I think if you look at the criteria of these global rankings, I think one big criterion is producing research which is published in the leading peer-reviewed journals globally. There, I'm afraid, in the case of India, we don't make the cut. And if you know, if this is a competitive situation, if you don't make the cut in one big criterion, you tend to lose out. Correct me if I'm wrong, sir.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Also on internationalization, we don't have international faculty, we don't have international students. All of that constitutes as a part of the criteria for defining a world-class university.
So, Ravneet, come in here. You know, when we look at this kind of scenario, how do global universities fare? Because, you know, we're looking at an India which is now more Indian students are going out to study than ever before, and they're looking at all of this, wouldn't you say? How seriously are they looking at rankings?
No, they look at rankings, definitely. I mean, Indian students are absolutely more and more cautious of rankings, and I think what they're understanding is, what does ranking really mean? So, you know, you could be in the top sort of 200 for as a university, but the course that you want to study or the program that you want to study, maybe that's being offered much better at another university. So while the students understand the three ranking that were just mentioned, I think in addition to that, they're also understanding, I want to know the ranking of this particular program in this particular university. Because I guess my view is that rankings are important, but also I guess what you need to underpin all of that is with excellence. You know, whether you're talking student mobility, staff mobility, whether you're talking research outcomes, or you're talking infrastructure, or you're talking capacity building, whatever you're talking about, I mean, the underlying principle has to be on excellence. And that's where I think the problem in some of our institutions, or most of our institutions in this country, is that we don't underpin it with excellence in what we want to do.
Okay, fair point. Kerry, you know, there are all those who would perhaps watch and say that, you know, we're talking about a sort of a very niche section of the Indian student here. We're talking about those who then can afford the best education that the world has to offer, the best education that India has to offer. But what that does is leave vast numbers of Indian students out of the running. What more do you believe can be done to sort of make it a level playing field, or at least more of a level playing field than it is today?
I come from a country where we've got about 37 universities Australia-wide, and I think we've just said there are 50,000 here in India. So I think there's a lot to do as far as dealing with the scale that you have here and the volume, because you have, I think it's 18 million 18-year-olds coming forward every year. So how do you deal with that volume of potential student coming through universities? I think you'd need some form of government policy reform, and probably some further prioritisation of courses, classes, enhancing student experience, investing in facilities, investing in infrastructure as far as not just bricks and mortar but in the cloud as well. I would expect would help that that sort of volume and with that number of universities too.
Okay, Sanjeev, it could be argued that, you know, we've been talking about this for long enough. We keep hearing this from the very top. I mean, the Prime Minister, successive governments, but this Prime Minister has talked about education time and time again, meeting entrepreneurs recently, corporates, and again talking about making education center stage. What do you believe is not being done?
So look, I think first of all, you've got to start with school education, because you will get great students into universities if you've got great students passing out of schools, right?
So start at the beginning.
I mean, you got to do.
By and large, I
you
see
got to
what
do all
you're saying.
simultaneously,
Yeah.
but you got to fix school education as well. Now, in a situation where maybe 70-80% of all schools are government schools, you got to improve government school education. Now, here different states are different because education is a state subject.
That's right.
It's a state subject. So some states have a great track record, some states don't. The other challenge when you come to higher education is that most of your capacity is in government or government-funded universities and institutions of higher learning. But there are private engineering colleges and private business schools which have come up under AICTE and are not universities yet, many of them. But there again, you see, there is some amount of, I think, fixing that needs to be done of who gets to educate. And then you will find that, look, the truth also is that you really can't charge market fees. You really can't charge the real cost. Okay, because it gets very expensive then. So excellence costs money, right? But you can't load that cost.
I just want to understand that better. Is that also because we have such few centers of excellence? I mean, if we would have more Ashokas and more Jindals and more these.
No, I'll tell you. See, if you want to attract, you simply don't produce enough great PhDs in this country, which means that if you want great PhDs, in the short run, you have to attract them from overseas. Secondly, you have to incentivize people to do PhDs. Yeah, right. So, I speak often at various engineering colleges and management schools, and one question I often ask is, how many of you want to come back here and teach? And very few hands go up. So, teaching is not a real aspirational career for very many students. And you've got to change that.
Because it may not be as lucrative. And also, I mean, one point I find the difference between, say, the Western world or what we see in India is the hunger for excellence in research, even in our top institutions.
We've spoken about this in the past.
Yeah, there is a lot of thing about, yes, you do that, you may tick the boxes, you may do, some people do it, but most would tick the boxes or do it. But I guess the need and the hunger to be able to be world class really
is just,
I feel
I think we've put research on the back burner for too long. But there's something else that you said which I want to get I want to get Rajkumar in, which is the kind of people getting into education. You drive a little out of Delhi, and I've just seen 2 weeks ago in MIT 1, 2, 3, and that was the Merit Institute of Technology 1 and Merit Institute of Technology 2 and 3, and it carried on.
And you add the word management and you'll find more.
Yeah, so again, this comes back to the point that was just being made earlier. How can we break out of this system? Because now we're seeing children end up in these institutions, degrees are dodgy, their careers are at risk, and sometimes the consequences are just extremely tragic.
So I think it's very important to get the trajectory of the growth and evolution of higher education. At the dawn of Indian independence, we had 20 universities, and today we have 800 plus. We have 50,000 higher education institutions, which comprising of colleges, standalone business schools, standalone law schools, of course colleges affiliated and autonomous and all of that. And for the last several decades, we never bothered about quality. So it's very important that we were busy focusing on expanding the higher education sector. I mean, at one level, and that's a dichotomy, it exists today too. We have 850 million people in India who are less than 35 years of age. These young people need to be educated. Our gross enrollment ratio, even after 60 years of higher education, is only 20%, which means over 70+% of people who are otherwise in a position to be educated, there are not enough institutions. We don't have faculty for existing institutions. So we are in a very unique set of crises which cannot be responded unless we compartmentalize different approaches to higher education reforms. And one thing which I would want to quickly respond to, one of the points about private versus public is, as of today, we have 70% of our higher education institutions are private, and 70% of students are also in private higher education institutions. The regulatory architecture that we need to have should enable the kind of investment that is needed for private sector. The only one thing I will say is that we should not make a mistake of promoting for-profit institutions.
Okay, I completely agree. Look, no good professor, no self-respecting professor will work for a for-profit institution.
Okay. But you see, when you look at world-class universities like, say, Deakin University, the investment that has been made in terms of physical infrastructure, talent acquisition, research and capacity building is significant. So we should not underestimate the need for significant resources.
But
and
where
it
what
comes
end
from,
is that
one can argue
investment being
about.
used,
Also,
perhaps? I just like to get, okay.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, I find that there is investment available in India now, if you agree, than what it was 5 years back.
Sure, but you know, see, but then the aspiration to be part of the global imagination has happened now, and we cannot be part of global imagination. Just to give you a perspective, if you pick up a first-rate a Peking or a Tsinghua university in China, and if you look at the research budget of one of those universities, and I tell you, even the research budget of, not research budget, the entire budget of all IITs put together will be less than the research budget of a leading Chinese university.